Vantassel or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here.
Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the PES Geek Podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board. I hope you're doing well. If you're new to this podcast is dedicated to those people who are involved in professional work with wildlife control. This is, some people may call it vertebrate pest control, and we provide technical, out of the ordinary information doing deep dives on all things related to wildlife control. So we tend to take a little bit more of an academic look, but with an eye towards some application for business and field work. So as I often say, if you're doing the same thing as everyone else in your business is doing, you're not going to have a competitive advantage. So hopefully this information will help improve the industry as well as improve your bottom line and perhaps maybe even save yourself a lot of time, money, and maybe even save your life at the same time. Well, we're really glad to have you on board. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, and give us a 5-star review if you'd be so kind in doing that. We'd love to have that. You can also reach out to me at WildlifeControlConsultant@gmail.com. That's WildlifeControlConsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from your thoughts about new shows. Perhaps you would like to be on the show. Perhaps you have a new product or service that you'd like to provide, or maybe even just have a gripe about the industry that you would like to discuss. I'm all ears. I'm all about providing information out to the public. So definitely reach out to me. Of course, if you have criticisms, we'll take those as well. I even have a podcast did a little while ago where someone wrote in and had some comments about something, and we responded to it. So don't think that you won't hear from us per se. I also publish our podcast up on Rumble. If you don't want to be dealing with the other video site, you can definitely go to Rumble. Just go to Wildlife Control Consultant and you can find my podcast there. All right, well, as some of you know, I have been doing some deep dives on the active ingredients of various rodenticides, and so I've been doing some work in the area of brodifacoum. So let me pull that PowerPoint up for you. And it's been a challenge to do some of this work on these active ingredients because there's a lot of reading involved, and the information is quite technical, as you can imagine. But given the level of concern that people have for rodenticides, and rightly so, these are dangerous products. They're toxic. I don't want to overstate the danger. You know, you may be looking at Stephen, you're calling brodifacoum the nuclear weapon of rodenticides. Yeah, that's a little bit of artistic shtick there, to be sure. But my point is that brodifacoum is the most toxic of the anticoagulants that we have in our toolbox for the control of rodents. So we're going to talk a little bit about this today. It's actually going to be at least a 2, maybe a 3-part series on brodifacoum. This is a serious rodenticide. So as professionals, you shouldn't just simply be looking at your product and looking at, you should be looking at the active ingredient and understanding how that works, because different active ingredients work differently. We have different classes of rodenticides, but even within those classes, there are differences among the active ingredients, and this is aside from formulation issues. And so this is where we're taking a deep dive down into the active ingredient brodifacoum. So as I call it, it's the nuclear weapon of rodenticides. Again, it's a little bit of hyperbole, a little overstatement. But not so much. It's true enough to should make you smile, but it's important to take this product in all rodenticides seriously. These are toxic ingredients that are designed to kill vertebrate animals, and so we should always be careful following that label, using best industry practices, trying to minimize non-target exposure. So we need to be concerned about it, but brodifacoum takes things to a very extreme level when we're dealing with rodenticides. So here is the essential world of rodenticide baits for in the United States. Now, I haven't included the biological control, like the birth control for rats from Sinestech out of Arizona. I haven't included that here. So these are primarily products designed to kill a rodent as opposed to stopping their reproduction. Okay, so just to be clear about that. So they basically break down, for those of you that are new to this area, the rodenticide baits. Again, these are products that are eaten by rodents and designed to kill them. That's where the rodenticides, SCIDE, means death or killing. So rodent killing baits. These are things that are eaten. They divide into two major categories: anticoagulants and non-anticoagulants. Anticoagulants are further divided into first generation and second generation anticoagulants. Just speaking broadly here, first generation anticoagulants require multiple feedings. That means the rodent has to feed once, come back, feed at least a second, possibly a third time, in order to consume enough bait to get a toxic dose to kill it. The second gen rodenticides only require a single feeding. That's how toxic they are. Now, they don't really die that much faster in terms of the second gen because the anticoagulants are designed to delay death, and that's to ensure that animals don't get wise to it. So the analogy I often use in my presentations is that if you went to a restaurant and 2 hours later you were in front of a toilet throwing your guts out, what's the likelihood of you going back to that restaurant? Well, we all know the answer to that. That's very low. Well, now imagine if you began throwing up 3 or 4 days later. Would you go back to that restaurant? Would you tie the two events together? The answer is probably not. That's why when it comes to these rodenticides, there's a delay before the rodent feels the effect. By the time the rodent feels the effect, it's already too late, essentially. Now, those are the anticoagulants. Animals will die typically within 3 to 9 days, sometimes a little bit longer, can go out to 11 days. It's all kind of dose dependent and other issues involved. But generally speaking, 3 to 4 days, sometimes 3 to 5 days, depending on dosage and size and all that kind of stuff. So it takes a little bit of time. Now, the non-anticoagulant baits, on the other hand, typically kill within a day or two, but that's not always the case. When we're dealing with zinc phosphide, they die within 12 to 24 hours. Same way with strychnine, they can actually die in just a few hours. Alpha chlorulose, they could die in a few hours, but bromethylin and cocalciferol, those are a little bit longer on the delay side. Okay, so they kind of act in terms of their lethality more like the anticoagulants. Now, as the last column on your right, you should see what kind of dosage is required, because you remember on the first generation anticoagulants, we required a multiple feeding. Second generation anticoagulants required only a single feeding. But in the non-anticoagulants, some products are multiple feeding, like cocalciferol. Some are single feeding, like bromethylin or zinc phosphide or alpha chlorulose. Now, you may go to different websites and have, in some of these products, like bromethylin, you may see that as a multiple feed product, or you may see cocalciferol possibly as a single feed product. So there's a little bit of ambiguity at times with these particular products. So I had to sort of make a decision. Obviously different animal behaviors can change this, but we're talking about averages or generalities, okay? But as a general rule, zinc phosphide's a single feeding, strychnine's a single feeding, alpha chlorulose will be a single feeding, And bromethylene and cocalciferol, things can get a little bit more squishy in that regard, okay? But I'm not going to take a deep dive down that at this particular time. I do have another podcast on bromethylene at this point, and I believe I've done some work on alpha chlorulose already, and I may have already done something on strychnine. So today I'm talking about brodifacoum. That's this one right up here. Now these are all put in alphabetical order, so don't think that these are ordered in the ratio of toxicity. They're just put in sort of an alphabetical type order. Obviously, except alpha chlorulose. Alpha chlorulose is a newcomer here to the United States. Now, for those of you that are outside the United States, just letting you know that these are the ingredients generally that are legal for us. You go to Europe, you may go to other countries, let's say like Africa. I don't know enough about the Caribbean area, but my suspicion is other countries outside of the United States will have a different toolbox. They'll have different products, maybe fewer, maybe more, maybe sometimes just different ones than what we have here in the United States. So if you have something that's legal in your country that you would like me to talk about, drop me a line. You can reach me at WildlifeControlConsultant@gmail.com, WildlifeControlConsultant@gmail.com, and I can sort of add that to the list. But as a general rule, I focus, of course, in the United States sector, and I do some type work sometimes with some things out of New Zealand and Australia and some of the English-speaking world. All right, so enough of all that. We're talking about brodifacoum here. So it's a second-generation anticoagulant, so it's going to be more toxic than what we have in the first-generation anticoagulants. All your second gens are more orders of magnitude more toxic than your first-generation anticoagulants. So here is the chemical formula for brodifacoum. If you don't have a chemistry background, it doesn't mean a whole lot to us, okay? But nevertheless, there it is. That's what it looks like. It kind of gives you that sort of physical structure for this particular toxicant. The CAS number is sort of an international chemical number that's assigned to this compound. So if you wanted to do additional research on it, or if you're looking to purchase it or something, it's tagged by this sort of international code, and that's the CAS number. So it's 56073-10-0. And so every compound, I guess that has maybe commercial viability, has the CAS compound. So I don't know enough about the CAS number other than it's a designation for that particular chemical. So it can be quite useful if you're doing an internet search for it, right? So that way you're focused on that particular chemical. So what does it look like? Well, in its basic state, it's a white to an off-white solid powder. And so obviously when we get it in a rodenticide, it's not white, right? So there's colorations, of course, the formulation is added to it. That's the formulation is the part of the bait to make it attractive to rodents and to also preserve it in sometimes harsh environments. Like you'll have a wax block, for example, that makes it more durable in more wet or moist environments. Also, rodents like to gnaw on things, and the wax is something they would like to chew on. It does have a very high rate of absorption via the mouth. So typically when we think about these rodenticides, we think about them being eaten, going down into the stomach and being digested and then absorbed through the stomach and the intestinal wall. Well, here's a particular product that could be absorbed right into the mouth itself. That, I'm just speculating here. I didn't have any research on this particular, but you just sort of wonder if maybe part of the reason why brodifacoum is so toxic is the fact that even animals that may be moving the product, like if you have a pelletized product, sometimes rodents will simply move that product to a new area, and maybe them even holding it in their mouth provides a way that they're already starting to absorb that brodifacoum that way. Don't know, just throwing that out there. So it's a relatively stable product. Lotus doesn't break down until it gets, up on 499 degrees. I mean, that's pretty hot. So that's a good thing. We don't have to worry about it breaking down in our bait stations in, let's say, the Georgia sun, for example. All right. Or perhaps those of you out in the Caribbean or in the African environments where it can get closer to that equator area, it can get pretty hot down there, right? So, it's not going to get so hot that it's going to be breaking down the active. It may break down your formulation, but it's not going to be breaking down the active ingredient, right? And so, but it's also not readily biodegradable, right? So that's sort of a concern. So if it's spilled out onto the soil, for example, it's not going to be decomposed. It could potentially maintain its lethality for an extended period of time, right? So it's not easily being broken down into its component parts. So the bonds of that chemical are holding that together pretty strongly, even when it's under harsh environmental conditions. So when was it developed? Well, it was developed in the mid-1970s, and a lot of your second generation anticoagulants were being developed because of the rise of warfarin resistance that was being discovered in the UK and has now been discovered in other parts of the world. So as many of you know in the pest control field, if you're using a particular treatment or chemical for an extended period of time, you'll often get selection bias within that population so that the survivors will pass on those resistant genes to the next generation. And then as time goes on, as you keep killing the vulnerable animals, the only ones that survive are the resistant ones. And so then it requires much more active ingredient to kill. And so that's what happened with warfarin. And so the work was being done to develop other rodenticides that would kill these resistant rodents that were resistant to warfarin. You say, well, what about chlorofascinone and difascinone? Well, the problem is that they found that animals that had warfarin resistance could sometimes exhibit resistance to, let's say, a difascinone. Chlorofascinone's sort of an interesting little chemical. It has, even though it's classified as a first-generation anticoagulant, it does seem to have some characteristics of a second gen. So some of these distinctions that we use aren't always as clean cut as sometimes is presented to us in class, for example. But nevertheless, that's why the second gens were developed, was to help us kill these rodents that were resistant to the earlier rodenticides. That's why they're second generation. AstraZeneca was a company that was developing this particular product, and they lost the patent in the 1990s, and so that opened it up for other companies to be able to sell brodifacoum and make baits related to that. So how palatable is brodifacoum? Well, the research has shown that house mice slightly prefer untreated bait to bait treated with brodifacoum, right? So this is an issue, because if an animal's not eating the bait, it doesn't matter how toxic the product is, right? It does. So consumption matters when it comes to these rodenticides. So we need to be sure that formulations are done in such a manner so that it would ensure an animal is actually going to eat it. Otherwise, if they're not eating it, it isn't going to work, right? So, and notice what they studied was 20 to 50 parts per million. And so this is where you're looking at your label and saying, all right, what is the parts per million in this particular product? And so you may find that it's 0.002%, right? So it's getting down there to 20 parts per million and also 50 parts per million. But notice, even though the mice liked untreated bait better, even when they ate the treated bait, they all died. So yeah, they liked untreated bait better than the treated bait, but when they ate that treated bait, it didn't matter. They were whacked. So it just tells you a little bit about how toxic brodifacoum actually is. So let's take a look at some numbers. Many of us, of course, are using LD50s. Now, those of you not familiar with LD50 is lethal dose 50% of the population. So what does that mean? Well, when they do a study, they basically take a population, let's say 20 rodents, and then they feed the rodents a dosed amount of the product. And then they determine, all right, if half of them die, that's your LD50, lethal dose 50%. And then they calculate that based on a milligram per kilogram rate. So notice how small amounts they are here. So we have the black rat. That's why the rodent there is in black. Okay, we're talking about roof rats. The male is 0.26 milligrams per kilogram. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment. A milligram is 1/1,000,000th of a kilogram. A kilogram is 2.2 pounds. So if you take a 2.2 pound block of something, slice it into 1,000,000 parts, about 1/4 of one of those slices is what it would take to kill 50% of a 2.2 pound animal. Now, are roof rats 2.2 pounds? No, they're probably more like 14 to 16 ounces, thereabouts, maybe down to 12, depending on how whether it's eaten or recently or whatever. So you're really looking at something that's going to be more like 0.1 milligrams per pound. Okay, so understand it's all relative to the weight of that particular animal, right? So these are going to be extraordinarily small amounts. So that's just why they can be killed in one feeding. Okay, all they've got, because they're going to eat enough of that bait to get enough of that rodenticide inside of that bait to kill them. Okay, so the females only require 0.22 milligrams per kilogram. And now notice how the research was telling us whether these were lab rats or whether these were wild rats. And so this is where the research gets kind of sticky, because sometimes there's some differences within wild rats versus lab rats. Lab rats have a clean genetic line, and so they're not exposed to a lot of things out in the wild per se. So notice how I'm giving you some additional information about the roof rat. So those of you working in roof rat areas, Rodifacum, it does not take a lot to whack your. If that roof rat's eating any part of that, he's going to be a goner. Okay. Now, how about the brown rat? That's your Norway rat for the, so similar amounts here, right? So 0.22 for females, 0.26 for males. And notice when the wild rats occur, though, it requires a little bit more to kill them, right? So now we're at 0.32. So that's sort of interesting how a wild Norway rat takes more to kill than a lab version. Okay, and some of this study was done in China. How about house mice? That's the gray animal there at the bottom. Notice how much more it takes. House mice, if you didn't know this already, are rather resistant to a lot of our rodenticides. So when I mean resistant, it just takes a lot more to kill a mouse than it does a rat. Rats are relatively wimpy when it comes to rodenticides. Not the case with mice. Mice require a lot more. But again, it's all relative, because how small is a mouse? If we're dealing with an animal that may be 1 or 2 ounces, that doesn't, it's not going to take a whole lot, but it does, on a percentage ratio scale, it requires a lot more to kill a mouse in terms of the active ingredient. Notice what it is here. For females, it's 8.1 milligrams per kilogram, whereas a male, it's only 0.4. So females, and that's the one we really got to be thinking about, killing females. It takes, what are we talking about? For 1,600% more anticoagulant to kill a female house mouse than it does a male house mouse. That's amazing. So it's something just to keep in the back of your mind if you're using a product and you're not getting the kind of control that you need. Maybe you've killed off all the males and you're only dealing with the females left, right? So this is something to think about, right? So that means she has to eat more of that bait to get enough of that rodenticide inside of her. And then you have another piece of research which points out here it has a 0.85. You're saying, well, that's a big difference. Well, this is one of the challenges when we're looking at the literature. Different studies have different rates. They rarely are going to be identical. And there are some reasons for that. Sometimes some of them are doing feeding studies. Some of them are doing gavage studies. Gavage is where they're actually forcing it down the animal's throat and giving them a specific dose. And, how much were they allowed to eat? Was it a choice test? Was it a non-choice test? Choice test is where the rodent has the ability to eat the poison food versus the non-poison food. A no-choice test, obviously, they're forced to eat the poison food. They don't have another option. So all those types of variables impact what the results are of the particular research. So if you're wondering why the numbers are different, it's completely normal. No one's trying to pull the wool over your eyes. No one's trying to lie. It's just showing you that different studies have different sort of results based on how they configured the study. Okay, to put it briefly there. All right, take a look at some other data. So here we have some formulations. So we're getting results. How long did it take to kill these rats? Here we're dealing with wild brown rats. That's your Norways, right? How long did it take? And notice the concentrations here of the Brodifacoum. Pellet versus rolled oats, oatmeal bait, rice-based bait. Notice with the rolled oats, you had 2 feeding days, 8 died, 10 survived. In the rolled oats, you had another one, had 5 died, 10 survived. So why is that, right? I mean, these are some of the questions that we have. So the question now is how much does formulation play a role in how a bait is being taken up into the animal? Right. I'm not suggesting it for this particular product, but some research that was done on zinc phosphide, for example, found that some rodents were able to select for grains of zinc phosphide that had less zinc phosphide than other grains of bait. That may be the reason why Brodifacoum was less effective in rolled oats, because what they do is they'll take the rolled oats, put it in a big container, and then put an oil or a sticker on, and then they will mix the Brodifacoum on the outside of that, and then roll it all together, so the Brodifacoum will then adhere to the sticker, which then adheres it to the rolled oats. Well, no matter how well you stir it all up, some grains of oats are going to have a more complete covering of Brodifacoum than another product, right? So this could account for why you had less success here, right? How about wild roof rats? Well, here we have another example of wheat and oil and millet and oatmeal and liquid. And notice how roof rats tend to have a little bit of resistance here to this particular product. They seem to be a little bit more harder to kill than your Norways, which is sort of interesting, right? But notice even with the 002, what they ate 3 days, they were able to get 20 out of all, 20 died and 0 survived, right? So clearly it's effective, but you want to look at this data, not that you're trying to memorize this information, God forbid that you want to do that, but you want to look at it and say, okay, if you're having it, what kind of formulations are you using? How long has the animal been feeding on it? Because we've talked about Brodifacoum being a single dose bait, and that's true. But for an animal maybe who didn't absorb it as well as another animal, having him get a second or a third dose obviously would make it more likely that he's going to die, right? So therefore, on a 3 feeding days, 100% kill, right? So that's something to always keep in the back of your mind. Whenever we use the word resistance, we don't mean proof. Resistance just means it takes more to kill an animal as opposed to a non-resistant animal. Doesn't mean that this other animal can eat Brodifacoum with no ill effects. No, not at all. It just means they have to eat a little bit more to get the negative effect that would be in an animal that has no resistance. Okay. So here we have house mice. House mice, again, pretty susceptible to this product. But notice the ICI pellet, for some reason, even with 3 feeding days, had some survivors, which is sort of unusual. It's a little bit surprising there. And that's at a fairly high dose here. Notice there's a big difference here between 0005 versus 005, right? So this is very little and had really, really good results, but notice for some reason the pellet, the animal survived. So who knows what happened there? I don't know, but it just shows you that there's some variability, but overall, you're getting a high level of lethality with Brodifacoum. And how about deer mice, right? So Paramyscus maniculatus, for many people across the United States, deer mice are a significant issue. I think they're an under-recognized. I have a whole presentation that I do on deer mice. And it's unfortunate that they have not gotten the kind of attention that they need. So much energy is put into house mice, but many times the animals that are in our house aren't house mice, they're deer mice, right? Depending on where you live. And here we have the ICI pellet with deer mice, one feeding day, and all of them died. Okay, so it just shows you how different species can react differently to rodenticides, and so maybe the house mouse has developed a little bit of resistance over the years. Who knows, right? It's hard to say. Maybe its metabolism is a little bit different for whatever reason. But when it came to Paramyscus maniculatus, the deer mouse, wham, they just got wiped out, right? So I don't want you to think that you're not supposed to trust your rodenticide here, right? Brodifacoum is incredibly toxic, right? So that's why I call it the nuclear weapon. I'm encouraging you to use Brodifacoum products sparingly. I'm encouraging you to use Brodifacoum for those jobs where you are struggling to get control. And rather than use it as your first line of attack, use other things first to see, because you want to hold back that sledgehammer, that big gun weapon, because we don't want to have resistance developing with Brodifacoum. Right? So it's sort of the same way that medical physicians are doing this now with some of their antibiotics, where we are getting bacteria that are becoming resistant to various antibiotics. So they're trying to not use a certain strand of antibiotics so that they have it available in case the other ones fail. They could bring out the big gun to finish this particular job. And that's kind of my theory on this. I would be interested in what your thoughts would be. But I'm suggesting that here is that you try to use Brodifacoum products. Keep that as you're like, okay, you're ace in the hole. I need to get this job done. Typically, that would be a client where they're not following your sanitation directions, or it's simply not possible for them to follow your sanitation directions. And I'll let you decide which is which, because we all know that if you're dealing with situations where animals have a lot of competing food, it is always going to be very difficult to control in those circumstances. And sometimes there's so much competing food, you may only have the chance of one bite of your product, right? So this is one of those areas where Brodifacoum takes it. Or if you're dealing with a situation where there is some resistance with some of your other products, there has been some areas in the world where they're experiencing some resistance in some of your second generation anticoagulants. Not a lot, but they're certainly experiencing some. And so Brodifacoum may be something you'd have in your back pocket for those situations where, all right, we need to come in and just bang, wipe this out. But don't also forget the role of traps as well, and exclusion, particularly when we're dealing with structures, right? So don't just simply try to poison your way to freedom here. Think about using an integrated approach. So try to do some sanitation, try to do some exclusion, try to do some trapping, and then when necessary, use some of these rodenticides. But keep Brodifacoum as, not as your second line of defense when you really need to bring out something big, because the other things aren't working for you. That's my opinion on that. All right, well, I hope you've enjoyed this so far. We have a lot more to cover when we're dealing with Brodifacoum. You can certainly reach out to me at WildlifeControlConsultant@gmail.com. That's WildlifeControlConsultant@gmail.com. Do keep in mind that this particular Living the Wildlife podcast, we're dealing with issues that are going to be very technical for your applicators, because we want you to understand the products that you're using so you can be a better pest control professional. And that's the desire here. I'm a part of the PES Geek Podcast contributor here. We each have our own shows, but we kind of help my work is part of Franklin's work. I have my own show, but think of it like, the Daily Wire. Each show is its own entity, right? So that's kind of what I have here, but I'm under sort of this umbrella where he does some marketing for me. So you can also visit me over on Rumble. I'd love to have you over there. Subscribe to my channel. I usually post there more quickly than it's posted on the other particular channel. Do subscribe, ring the bell. We'd love to have a 5-star review, and of course, comments, questions, suggestions. You can certainly reach out to me at WildlifeControlConsultant@gmail.com. Well, that's the end of part 1 on Brodifacoum. We'll be talking more about Brodifacoum in a future podcast. So stay tuned. And you've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everyone.